Told me I didn't belong there. Said it quietly, almost politely, the way people do when they want to humiliate you without raising their voice. I looked at her for a moment. This woman in her tailored blazer standing in the middle of a room I had paid for, and I nodded. Then I picked up my jacket, walked out to the parking lot, sat in my truck and called my attorney. That was a Thursday evening in October. By Monday morning, everything had changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because none of this makes sense without the full picture. And the full picture took me about 30 years to build. My name is Howard Briggs. I'm 58 years old and I've been a licensed plumber since I was 23. I know what that sounds like to some people. I know the look, the slight pause, the polite smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I've been getting that look my whole adult life, and I stopped caring about it somewhere around my 40th birthday. What I do matters. I built a business from a single truck and a tool belt into a company with 11 employees and contracts with 3 commercial property management firms in the county. I'm not wealthy by some people's definitions, but I own my house outright. I have no debt. I put my son through college, and when he met the woman he wanted to marry, I did something that I believed at the time was an act of love. I paid for the practice. Let me explain. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is, the most important person in my life. His name is Evan. He's 31 now. Smart kid, always was. He became a physical therapist, which I was proud of beyond words. He met a woman named Claudia during his graduate program. Claudia came from money. Old money. The kind that doesn't talk about itself. Her mother, Margot, was an orthopedic surgeon. Her father had retired early after selling a regional insurance company. They lived in a large house on the other side of the county, hosted dinner parties, belonged to a country club, and were, by every measure I could observe, deeply comfortable people. Claudia was not unkind to me at first. She was pleasant in a distant way. She shook my hand firmly, made eye contact, asked me appropriate questions about my work, but there was always something underneath it, a kind of careful politeness that told me she was managing the situation rather than enjoying it. I noticed. I always notice. You spend 30 years dealing with people in their homes, in their worst moments, flooded basements, burst pipes on Christmas morning, and you learn to read people quickly. Margot was a different matter entirely. The first time I met her was at a dinner at their house, about 8 months after Evan and Claudia started dating seriously. The house was beautiful. I'll give them that. Marble floors, artwork that probably cost more than my truck. Margot greeted me at the door in a way that reminded me of how a hotel concierge greets someone who has walked in off the street, clearly not planning to stay. Friendly enough, helpful, but with a certain baseline assumption about where you stood. Over dinner, she asked me what I did. I told her. There was that pause. Then she said, "Oh, that's so essential. We'd be lost without people like you." People like you. I finished my meal, thanked them for a lovely evening and drove home. I didn't say anything to Evan. He was happy. She made him happy. That was enough for me. About a year into their relationship, Evan came to me with something. He and Claudia had been talking about their future, and they had a dream. They wanted to open their own physical therapy practice together. Evan would handle the clinical side. Claudia had a business degree and would manage the administrative and financial operations. They had done the research. They had found a space, a commercial unit in a medical office building about 12 minutes from the hospital where Evan worked. The lease was $4,200 a month. Equipment would run close to $80,000. Build-out, licensing, insurance, marketing, they were looking at somewhere between $160,000 and $180,000 to get off the ground. Evan wasn't asking me to pay for it. I want to be clear about that. He came to me because he wanted my advice about small business loans. He knew I had been through the process of starting something from nothing and he wanted to talk it through. I listened to everything he told me. I asked questions. I looked at the numbers he had put together, and then I sat with it for 2 weeks. Margot and her husband were not going to fund this. I knew that without asking. Not because they couldn't, they absolutely could, but because Margot had very specific ideas about what Claudia should be doing, and opening a small practice with your plumber's son was not high on the list. She wanted Claudia to pursue a position at a hospital system, prestige, salary, benefits, a career that looked right on paper. What Evan and Claudia were planning was a risk. Small businesses fail, medical practices especially. I knew the odds, I had lived those odds myself. But I also knew my son. When Evan commits to something, he does not let go. He is methodical and careful and patient in a way that I sometimes take for granted because it's so consistent. And I believed in what they were trying to build. So I went back to him and I told him I would invest, not a gift, an investment. We drew up a proper agreement. I hired an attorney, a real one, not just a handshake, and I contributed $165,000 toward the startup costs. The agreement gave me a minority ownership stake in the practice and established a repayment schedule once the practice became profitable, typically within the first 3 years for a well-run clinic of their size. There was one condition I asked for, and Evan understood it immediately. I didn't want Claudia's family to know the details, not because I was hiding anything improper, but because I knew that Margot would find a way to make this uncomfortable. She would have opinions. She would want oversight. She would position it as charity from a tradesman and use it to undermine Evan's confidence in the venture. I had watched how she spoke to him at family gatherings, always just slightly diminishing, always in a way he couldn't quite catch and respond to. Evan agreed. The investment was documented. The attorneys had copies. But in the day-to-day story of how the practice came to be, I was simply a private investor. Claudia knew there was an investor. She did not know it was me. I am not proud of the secrecy. But I am not ashamed of it either. I made the decision I thought was right at the time, and I would make it again. The practice opened in March. I was there for the ribbon cutting, standing near the back of the small crowd, wearing my cleanest shirt and the sport coat I'd bought for Evan's college graduation. The space was beautiful, bright and clean, examination tables lined up along one wall, a reception area that Claudia had designed herself. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Margot was there too, of course. She arrived in a grey wool coat and stood near the front, accepting congratulations from a small group of colleagues and friends who had come. At one point she gave a brief speech about how proud she was of her daughter, how Claudia had always had the vision and the drive to build something of her own. She thanked several people by name. She did not mention me. She did not know to. I didn't mind. I stood in the back and watched my son shake hands with his first patient's family members, and I felt something that I can only describe as complete. That evening was the opening reception, a catered event to the practice space. About 60 people, wine and hors d'oeuvres. The kind of thing that costs more than it probably should, but sends the right message. I had contributed to that cost too as part of the initial marketing budget in our agreement. I was standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water when Margot appeared beside me. She had a glass of white wine and the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this conversation. "Howard," she said, "not warm, not cold, the temperature of a professional assessment." "Margot," I said, "beautiful evening." "It is," she agreed. Then she said, "I've been meaning to speak with you." I waited. "Claudia tells me you've been very involved, coming to meetings, offering your perspective on things." She paused. "I think it's lovely that you want to support Evan. Truly. But I hope you understand that this is a medical environment. The decisions being made here are sophisticated. Financial, clinical, regulatory. It requires a certain level of—" She searched for the word with the performance of someone who already knew exactly which word they wanted. "Expertise." "I understand," I said. "Claudia has her MBA. Evan has his clinical credentials. They worked very hard to build something credible here." She looked around the room with visible satisfaction. People respect what they've accomplished, and I'd hate for anything to muddy the waters, so to speak. Optics matter in healthcare. Who's in the room matters. I looked at her. I kept my voice very level. "Are you asking me to stay away from the practice?" She smiled. "I'm asking you to consider what role is appropriate for someone in your position." "Someone in your position." I set my glass down on the window ledge. I picked up my jacket from the chair beside me. I said, "Thank you for being direct, Margot. I appreciate clarity." And then I walked out. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. It was cold. I had the heater running, and I was looking at the lights through the practice window, the shadows of people moving around inside, the warm yellow glow of a room full of people celebrating something. And I made a decision. I called my attorney. It was after 7, but he picked up. I told him what had happened, and I told him what I wanted to do. He asked me if I was certain. I told him I was. He said he would have paperwork ready by morning. What most people don't understand about a minority investment agreement in a small business startup is what happens to the lease guarantees and equipment financing when the primary investor withdraws and triggers a review clause. I had insisted on that clause during negotiations, a standard provision that allowed me to request a full financial review and under specific conditions related to management decisions that materially affected the investment environment to accelerate the repayment schedule. Margot's conversation with me that evening qualified. I did not pull the money overnight. That's not how it works, and I wasn't trying to destroy the practice. That was never my intention. But by Friday of that week, my attorney had sent a formal notice to the practice's business accounts. The notice informed them that the primary investment was being restructured, that the equipment financing I had personally guaranteed would need to be transitioned to a new guarantor within 60 days, and that the lease, which had required my signature as a co-guarantor due to the LLC's limited operating history, would similarly need to be assumed. Evan called me that Friday afternoon. He was not angry. He was confused, and underneath the confusion he was scared, and I hated hearing that in his voice. I asked him if we could meet in person. He said yes. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I helped him with homework in 4th grade, where he told me he'd been accepted into his graduate program, where we ate Thanksgiving dinner every year, just the two of us, after his mother left when he was 12. I made coffee. I told him everything. I told him about the investment. I told him about the agreement. I told him about the conversation with Margot. He was quiet for a long time. "She said that to you," he finally said. "At the reception?" "She did." He put his hands flat on the table. I could see him working through it, processing, the way he always processes, methodically and without rushing. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you tell me about the investment from the beginning?" "Because I didn't want it to be complicated," I said, "and I didn't want her to make it about something it wasn't. But now it's complicated." "Now it's complicated," I agreed. He asked me what I wanted, not what I was owed, not what my rights were under the agreement, what I wanted. That question is why Evan is who he is. I told him I didn't want anything from the practice. I told him I wanted to be released from the lease guarantee and the equipment financing, and I wanted him to find another path forward, whether that meant Margot's family stepping in, a bank loan, a new investor, whatever made sense. I told him I would give them 90 days instead of 60, and that I would not charge interest on the outstanding amount. I told him I wanted him to be successful, and I meant it without conditions. What I did not tell him, what I waited for him to understand on his own, was what this meant about who had built what. He figured it out. He's smart. He sat there in my kitchen and he traced the whole thing backward. The equipment, the build-out, the lease, the reception, catering, the marketing materials, all of it. And he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was about 9 years old and had just realized something about the world that couldn't be unrealized. "She doesn't know," he said. "Not a question." "No," I said. He nodded very slowly. "She's going to have to ask her parents." "That's my understanding of the situation," I said. He almost smiled. Almost. Then he looked down at his coffee and was quiet again. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not anger. That had burned out in the parking lot. Something quieter. The specific feeling of a man who has spent his life doing what needed doing without acknowledgement and without complaint, and has finally, for one clear moment, been seen. The next 6 weeks were not easy for Evan and Claudia. I know this because he called me regularly. and because I could hear it in his voice. Margot's family did provide a bridge loan, enough to stabilize the lease and the equipment financing while they arranged longer-term refinancing. I was told this through Evan. I had no direct communication with Margot or Claudia's father during this period. About 7 weeks after our kitchen table conversation, Evan called and asked if I would come to Sunday dinner. Not at Claudia's family home, at Evan and Claudia's apartment. Just the three of us. I went. Claudia had cooked a real meal, not takeout, the kind of thing that takes most of an afternoon. She poured wine. We sat down, and about 20 minutes in, she put down her fork and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," she said, "not just for what my mother said, for not knowing sooner, for not asking questions I should have asked." She paused. "And for letting someone speak to you that way in a room that you made possible." I looked at her. I thought about the ribbon cutting and her mother's speech and standing in the back in my sport coat. "Thank you," I said. "That means a great deal." Margot called me once, about 2 weeks after that dinner. The conversation was brief. She said she understood now what I had done for the practice. She said she hoped we could move forward. She did not apologize. Not directly, not in any way that required her to name what she had said. But she spoke to me differently than she ever had before. Like a person speaking to another person. That was enough. I wasn't looking for a ceremony. The practice is doing well. Evan told me last month that they're running at full patient capacity and thinking about bringing on a third therapist. The refinancing is solid. They're paying themselves reasonable salaries for the first time since the opening. My name is not on anything there. I am not on the letterhead or the website or the plaque by the front door. I don't need to be. I'm a plumber from the county who spent 30 years doing work that people like Margot categorize as essential without ever stopping to think about what essential actually means. I know what I built. I know what I protected. And I know that my son, at Sunday dinner in a warm apartment with a good meal in front of him, looked at me across the table and saw exactly who I am. That's the only credential that ever mattered to me. I've been doing this work long enough to know that most things eventually come back around. Not because the universe is keeping score, I don't think about it that way, but because actions have consequences, and consequences don't care about your zip code or your job title or how many letters you have after your name. Margot walked into that reception believing she was the most important person in the room. In a way, she was right. She was the most visible. She had the right clothes and the right posture and the right way of speaking that signals to people that she expects to be listened to. I've been around people like that my whole life, and I learned something about them a long time ago. They're very good at identifying what something looks like and very bad at understanding what it actually is. What the practice looked like was her daughter's achievement, supported by her daughter's family. What it actually was something a plumber from the county built quietly over 11 months while nobody was watching. That's not me being bitter. That's just the truth, what I've come to understand. And it took me most of my adult life to really absorb this. Is that character is not something you perform. It's something you practice in private when no one is offering you credit for it. I made that investment because I believed in Evan and I believed in what he was trying to build. Not because I wanted a plaque on the wall, not because I expected gratitude, because it was the right thing to do for someone I loved, and I had the means to do it. The problem with doing things quietly, for the right reasons, is that other people sometimes fill the silence with their own assumptions. Margot assumed I was a peripheral figure, a pleasant enough inconvenience that came with the territory of her daughter marrying a working man's son. She made decisions about who I was based on what I did for a living, and she acted on those decisions in a room full of people, in a building I had signed the lease for. That's not a character flaw that comes from being wealthy or educated. I know plenty of wealthy, educated people who are decent. It's a character flaw that comes from never being required to look closely at your own assumptions. When you move through the world being deferred to, you stop questioning your own judgments. You start to believe that your instincts about people are accurate simply because no one has ever pushed back. Evan pushed back. Not loudly. That's not who he is. But he sat at my kitchen table and he listened to the whole story, and then he said quietly, "She doesn't know." And in those 3 words he understood everything: what had been built, who had built it, and what it meant that the person being dismissed had been the one holding the whole thing together. Claudia came to her own understanding on her own timeline. I didn't rush that. The apology she gave me at that dinner table cost her something. I could see it in the way she sat still before she spoke, and anything that costs something is worth more than anything that's easy. I respected her for it. What I want anyone to take from this is simple: do the work. Do it well. Do it honestly. Keep records, not for revenge, but because integrity without documentation is just a feeling, and feelings don't hold up in a review clause. Invest in the people who deserve it. Draw your lines quietly and hold them without drama. And if someone ever looks at you and says you don't belong in the room, smile, pick up your jacket, and remember that you probably built the room.